Hello and welcome back to the Cipher Briefs virtual studio, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation on trade, tariffs, and how they factor into national security. When we think about national security, our minds typically go to military strength, intelligence operations, and diplomacy. But economic policy, and specifically the use of tariffs, play a crucial role in shaping America's security and global influence. The Trump administration made tariffs a central piece of its economic strategy, using them to pressure adversaries, protect key industries, and restructure global supply chains. But how effective has this approach been? What are the risks of wielding tariffs as a national security tool? And how does this strategy compare to other administrations' approaches? Joining us for this conversation is John Hillman. He is a senior fellow for geoeconomics at the Council on Foreign Relations. John, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start right from the top. How have tariffs historically been used as a national security tool, and how has that strategy evolved under the Trump administration?
So on the one hand, using tariffs for national security is not new. Many of the authorities that the Trump administration is using have been on the books for quite some time, in some cases half a century or longer. So there's a track record of using some of these. Some of them have been used for national security purposes in the past. Others, it's a little bit more of a stretch, and so there are some legal questions as well. The Trump administration is also using and continuing a trend of sort of expanding the definition of national security. And so that's something that really goes back to the period just following 9/11, when there was a willingness to look at trade and national security. And in the past, tariffs had been assessed mainly in the context of protecting national defense and critical infrastructure. And there had been then, after 9/11, a willingness to sort of expand that to include other critical parts of the U.S. economy. And so now you see the Trump administration using things like Section 232, which is a national security tool, to protect things like lumber from Canada, which on their face don't seem to be as immediate to national security.
Interesting. So the administration has sort of expanded the original idea of what we know as using trade and tariffs as part of national security policy.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that this didn't happen overnight, but in some ways this is it's definitely an expansion, and it'll be interesting to see the assessments that the government needs to do to go through to justify some of the actions that are being threatened.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
In your opinion, in what ways do economic policies such as tariffs strengthen or weaken our national security?
So there's I think a myriad number of ways that they can impact U.S. national security, starting at sort of the most basic sense that the U.S. economy is really the foundation for other types of power, right? We need a strong economy to help in order to have a strong military or to have, innovative tech companies. Tariffs can also, and trade more generally, could also be used as a tool to advance national security objectives. So we see them being threatened now with requests made of trading partners that may be non-economic in nature, right? So threatening Canada and Mexico with tariffs, for example, to help address immigration or the flow of illicit drugs would be one example. So there's a range of ways in which this could theoretically be used. And then I think there's a whole bunch of questions about what the actual impacts will be.
And in your opinion, how has this second administration compared to the first administration as far as the use of trade and tariffs go?
So, look, on the one hand, the first Trump administration did use tariffs quite aggressively. President Trump, during his first term, had, I think, 8 Section 232 cases, more than any other U.S. president, and that was in a single term. And so this is clearly one preferred tool. They did, however, though, have a process for exemptions. So, for saying for specific companies or goods or countries, in some cases, were able to get exemptions from these tariffs. That may still happen, but at least what we've been told so far is that there's much less willingness to provide those exemptions. And so we're looking at really a much broader range of potentially sectors being hit and a much broader range of trading partners.
And speaking to that, can you break down for me the key industries where tariffs were applied with a national security rationale under this administration?
Sure. So I think a lot of this is going to be announced tomorrow. The first Trump administration, they did put tariffs on steel and aluminum, and they have basically resuscitated those tariffs and taken away the exemptions that were put into place, so that they've already done that. They've also used tariffs against Canada and Mexico, not on specific sectors. And we could see further sectoral types of tariffs. The president has mentioned semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and a couple of other sectors that could see further action. And we'll have to see whether that's justified as purely being a national security move, or if they use authorities that are sort of more grounded on economic rationale.
Historically, how have tariffs disrupted global supply chains, and what has that meant for U.S. economic security?
Yeah, it's a great question, because when these tools are used, they can sometimes have unintended consequences. I think we're starting to see a little bit of that already in the stock market, for example, and American farmers being concerned about their ability to export to foreign markets, and American families having to pay more at the grocery store. And so those are all, early warning indicators of adverse economic consequences. But then there's a whole other set of potential diplomatic consequences and strategic consequences for using these tools. All of our trading partners have their own constituents and stakeholder groups that they need to stand up for. And I'm struck right now by a lot of the language that is being used by close U.S. partners and allies like Canada, the EU, and others, that it's tough language like, we're going to stand up for our own interests, we're prepared to fight back. It would all sound familiar if they were talking about Beijing instead of Washington, right? And so there will be hopefully negotiations and hopefully some firmer ground that this all lands on. But in the meantime, there is this risk that sort of extends beyond economics toward harming diplomatic relations, pushing partners away, and potentially pushing them closer to our competitors.
That was going to be my next question. In your opinion, to what extent so far, you're talking about this language that you're hearing from some of our key allies, to what extent so far have tariffs damaged diplomatic relationships with our key allies, or is that yet to come? Are you just starting to see that on the surface?
So I think we're seeing different degrees of restraint from our partners and allies right now. Look, a lot of them want to negotiate and get to a better place on trade. Hopefully that still happens. But the rhetoric that they've used, even as restrained as it is quite striking. And so from Canada, for example, we had the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, talking about how Canada was going to have to do things that would have been unthinkable, and it's going to have to do them faster than ever to diversify their trading relations. Again, talking about the United States and not China. So I think we can expect that that rhetoric may heat up before it cools down. But I think real negotiations still need to take place here.
And the rhetoric that you're hearing from our key allies, would you call that language and the things that are being said, would you call that something that's maybe unprecedented towards the United States?
Well, I think if you go back to the first Trump administration, there were definitely some tough words exchanged. And look, it's okay for close friends to speak candidly with each other. I think in the world of diplomacy, you hope that happens behind closed doors and not out in public. But that is a concern right now, that there are a lot of ingredients here. Again, everyone has their own stakeholders and constituents to defend, that there's some dynamics and incentives in place here that may be that could cause unintended escalation and sort of go beyond the sort of temporary exchange of words. But again, hopefully there's some negotiation and some ratcheting down.
If there's not negotiations, or if this continues down the path that we see it going down now, do you predict that these aggressive tariffs policies could push our allies and our adversaries possibly into closer trade partnerships without the United States?
I think that we're already beginning to see beginnings of that. I mean, we've got South Korea and Japan having trade discussions with China, in a format that they haven't for about 5 years or so. We've got other trading partners speaking with each other, and it's just worth pointing out that as the U.S. raises barriers, others may decide to cooperate and lower their own among each other, because that is still in their interest to do so.
And looking forward, what are the potential risks of relying too heavily on tariffs as a national security tool? Clearly, maybe our adversaries and our allies coming together could be one of them, but do you see anything else that could be a potential, danger of relying on this?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges right now is that tariffs are being used or held up as essentially the Swiss Army knife for all challenges. And there's a long list of objectives that are being pursued with these tariffs. So everything from dealing with illegal immigration and fentanyl, to wanting to reshore manufacturing and attract investment into the U.S., to wanting to support jobs in some cases, to wanting to support exports, to wanting to raise revenue for the government that would help enable lowering of taxes and other areas. That's just a very, very long list of objectives. And it's unlikely, and in fact impossible, I think, that tariffs can achieve all of those objectives. So we're going to have to see, I think, a little bit of choosing among them and some maybe honest accounting of those trade-offs.
Do you think using tariffs effectively, do you think that it deters economic threats from countries like China and our other adversaries, or does it merely just escalate tensions as we've seen recently?
So look, if you're viewing tariffs as a tool for negotiation, then it is a tool. It could be a means. It's not the only tool. I think that some of the bigger questions are whether the U.S. will make the investments it needs to reduce some of the vulnerabilities it has, because those will not go away overnight. In some cases, we're talking about very complicated and international supply chains that, in the absolute best case scenario, could take 5 or more years to relocate meaningfully. So this is going to be really a long process, and tariffs alone will not fix the problem.
And can you go into specifics regarding where the U.S. is vulnerable in that supply chain?
Sure. So I think we saw some of this during the early days and months of the COVID pandemic, right? I think some of the fragility of global supply chains was exposed in the U.S. reliance on some markets, particularly in Asia, for critical inputs, from semiconductors to pharmaceuticals, in some cases, to a whole host of components for power and energy production. And there are others, right? The military relies on, U.S. military has its own set of supply chains that are important. U.S. critical infrastructure has its own set of supply chains, and the U.S. cannot, just from a pure economic perspective, cannot afford, just with the resources, especially that the government has that are quite limited, to reshore all of that and become entirely self-sufficient. And so I think the question is about where to prioritize, how to spend the limited resources that do exist, and then who to work with, which partners and allies to work with, because the U.S. cannot address all of these areas alone.
Amazing. John, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks.